prison was a bit of surprise on that day. We were sitting in a room, a very small room that was very cold. It was really a kind of subdivided room from the large auditorium. They called it a library, and it did have some books in it, but mostly it was just a room. I'd seen a prisoner sleeping in there one time. It was just a room that sometimes people went into. And so we were told to hold the class in that room. We were all sitting around a large table, I and another philosopher named Sway. There were about a dozen prisoners, inmates that were sitting there, women. And some of them I knew from before, having had taught drawing at that particular prison not very long before that. So some of them I knew and some of them I didn't know. One I knew, and I actually had not liked her. That's unusual. Generally, I like all of the women. They're interesting, fun, each in their very different ways. But this woman I had thought was a liar. She had told me that she was a teacher and had a master's degree in biology, and I just hadn't believed her. Come to find out, I was wrong. She was not a liar. Anyway, this woman is sitting at about 2:00 from me, and she starts talking about her experiences. And she says that when she was a teacher at her school, the students would bite her and kick her and hit her. Another woman directly to my left, who had introduced herself earlier as a Muslim woman, grabbed up her papers and her folders angrily and stormed out of the room. I was a little surprised, but then again, we were talking about feminism and physical victimization of women and things like that. And so, maybe emotions are raw. Anyway, when we took a break some time later, the class was 3 hours long, we walked out of the room, and this woman, this Muslim woman who had gotten so angry before, is walking towards me, still very visibly angry. Now, she's larger than I am, and she points to me and says, "I want to talk to you." And she turns to the guard who's standing there and says, "Mr. Jones, I want to talk to you too. I want you to be there." And Mr. Jones, who I had never met before, the regular guard that I had always dealt with, was absent that day. And Mr. Jones sort of said, no, I gotta go to the office. And the inmate turned to him again and she said, "No, I want you to be there." And he says, "No, I gotta go to the office." And he just walks away. And so I'm left there with this visibly angry inmate who comes over to me and close to me, looks down at me slightly. She's a bit taller and quite a bit bigger. And she says to me, "I was sexually abused as a small child, and I am not going to sit there and tolerate some inmate justifying her crime as a sexual abuser." And I was really taken aback. I was taken aback both by the directness of it, but more than that, I was taken aback by my own naivete. I had never thought of the inmates as being victimizers. I had thought of them, at least in terms of sexual violence, as more likely to be the victims. And so I was confronted with a reality that I didn't expect. I talked her into sitting down at a table nearby, and we talked for about 15 minutes. And she calmed down. Over that conversation, she calmed down and actually ended up hugging me in the end, which was a relief. But the conversation itself was utterly fascinating, and I've never forgotten it. She starts by telling me a little bit of her history. And she says to me that she was sexually abused as a child, and then taken out of her home and put into foster care. And it was really intolerable and awful. She eventually ran away from the foster home and was living as a homeless teenager on the street. I stopped there and asked her, I said, so what are you incarcerated for? And I never asked that question of anybody. I always kind of figure it's not my right to ask. It's none of my business. But she didn't seem at all daunted by the question. And she said, well, I was a recruiter for ISIS. And I thought she said a recruiter for ICE. And I was like befuddled because I thought, well, ICE doesn't really need recruiters. I just put an ad in the paper and it's fine. And then I asked her again and she repeated it. And then I understood that she was a recruiter for ISIS. So I thought, that's funny. Gosh. And she was really mad at me. I'm glad I worked this one out. And then we talked some more about it. And she said to me that she had experienced so much violence as a small child that, in her words, a little bit more violence didn't really mean that much. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, states, life is essentially, and the word essentially is capitalized. Nietzsche does this sort of Trump style. Essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and, at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. End quote. Later in that paragraph, he names the winners and losers by calling them master morality and slave morality. And he continues to define master morality in conjunction with that notion of life as appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and, at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. End quote again. Or we could paraphrase, we, the strong ones. But is this true? We mustn't forget David Hume's dictum regarding confusing an is with an ought. In other words, just because something is a certain way doesn't mean it ought to be. Let me rephrase this. Society grants power to those who have grabbed it. The power is legitimized. It is a fact. It is. That doesn't mean, though, that it ought to be that way. John Stuart Mill, in his essay, The Subjection of Women, states it like this. Laws and systems of polity always begin by recognizing the relations they find already existing between individuals. They convert what was a mere physical fact into a legal right, give it the sanction of society, and principally aim at the substitution of public and organized means of asserting and protecting these rights, instead of the irregular and lawless conflict of physical strength. Those who had already been compelled to obedience became in this manner legally bound to it. Slavery, far from being a mere affair of force between the master and the slave, became regularized and a matter of compact among the masters who, binding themselves to one another for common protection, guaranteed by their collective strength the private possessions of each, including his slaves. Okay, so then we might ask, is it natural then for the strong to dominate? Or, to phrase it differently, is domination natural? Let's leave aside the popular press's insistence on testosterone, which of course is ill-formed. Many scientific studies have shown that testosterone increases after a win, instead of being the cause of the win. People have their cart before the horse. One more sign of a failing logic test by society. Instead, I'll stop here and wonder about the role of habit in all of this. What causes one to dominate? Like many things, it is overdetermined, but surely both one's membership to a group that has already climbed up the dunghill of domination is part of it. You know what I mean here. If you're rich, of the right national group in the world, or the right religious group in your country, probably if you're male, all of those things, you have a much better chance of asserting domination than your opposite does. It has nothing to do with personality or with character or even with hormones. John Stuart Mill is right. The collective strength wields much weight. If you, by the luck of the draw, find yourself in that group, then you are golden. It catapults its members up over the objections of others. Habit then rules. The habits of society and the habits and assumptions one grows up with, as well as the training one exerts over oneself. William James, the wonderful William James, in his essay on habit stated it thus: "Can we now form a notion of what the inward physical changes may be like in organs whose habits have thus struck into new paths? In other words, can we say just what mechanical facts the expression change of habit covers when it is applied to a nervous system?" He states later on in that essay, "The whole plasticity of the brain sums itself up into two words when we call it an organ in which currents pouring in from the sense organs make with extreme facility paths which do not easily disappear. For of course, a simple habit, like every other nervous event, the habit of snuffling, for example, or of putting one's hands in one's pockets, or of biting one's nails, is mechanically nothing but a reflex discharge, and its anatomical substratum must be a path in the system." He wrote this, of course, a long time ago, but he pretty much figured out the neurological basis of habits. He also points out in this essay that it is much easier to change one's habits when one is young. It's never impossible to change one's habits, but it is extraordinarily hard. I think this is true whether or not the habits are rewarding one with domination or with submission. It is hard to step outside one's habitual step-by-step maneuvers in life and assess the justice of them. The former ISIS recruiter, inmate, finished our conversation by telling me this: she had talked to many therapists over the last few years in prison and come to face the truth that violence was truly not the answer. She had tears in her eyes when she told me this, when she told me her decision to turn away from violence. And my heart went out to her. I hoped the new habit would stick.